Hello, MrShine here, back once again for another edition of my Arena Quiz series. There was enough interest in the last video series that I'm going to be completing a quiz for every Arena class, starting with some of the least used heroes and working my way up from there. So in this video we'll be climbing into the arena as the Grizzly Warrior Orc Grommash. Let's quickly analyze some of the pros and cons. Some of the strongest weapons in the game can only be found in a warrior deck. Fiery War Axe sometimes can win games on its own and with its incredibly efficient removal power that can set up early board control. If that isn't enough, Arathi Weaponsmith is an incredible 2/2 weapon that includes a 3/3 minion for just 4 mana. Arcanite Reaper isn't a slouch either, and of course if you can draft a Gorehowl, you'll have removal that keeps on giving. Warrior also has some strong minions in the Kor'kron Elite, Frothian Berserker, and the Warsong Commander. Kor'kron is a strong, cheap charge minion, while Frothian and Warsong act as cards that need to be dealt with immediately, otherwise they'll get out of control. Warriors also have some strong removal with Cleave, Slam, and Execute, and Brawl if you're lucky to draft one. If you can draft a deck that makes use of the Warrior's aggressive board clearing while establishing your own early game aggression, you can go pretty far in the arena. The biggest con is the Warrior's hero ability. It can sometimes help shelter you from the last ditch damage from an aggressive opponent, keeping you out of lethal range, but otherwise the hero ability doesn't affect the board state, so playing it early in the game will almost always set you back in tempo. In addition, I talked about the strong weapons a Warrior has available. The downside is if you don't get a draft that can get a few of those weapons, you're going to be having a harder time maintaining board control in the early game, and will need to exclusively rely on solid individual minions and smart trades to claw your way out of an early game hole. Without a way to deal 1 damage with a hero ability, a smart opponent is going to give you fits with efficient trading. Outside of the removal cards I mentioned earlier, many of the Warrior spells are a bit clunky and rely on you having injured minions on the board to gain maximum effect. Unless you have a deck designed specifically for control or enraging minions, you're not often going to be thrilled to see most of the Warrior spells. So with all that said, let's see if we can pick out a deck that A. ensures some 2-drops, B. prioritizes weapons, and C. relies on efficient minions to carry us through the early game into the late. Like my previous Priest Arena quiz, I will be pausing between draft selections to give you, the viewer, a chance to pause the video and make up your own minds regarding which card you would add to your deck. Each card will then be given a point value, which we'll analyze at the end of the draft. Instead of starting from 0 and going up like last time, everyone will begin with 100 points, and you'll deduct points for every pick that's suboptimal. To be clear, this means in this quiz you'll want to be choosing the cards I value at 0 points, and will be docked 1 or 2 points if you choose a poor card. This is designed in this way to make it easier to keep track of your score instead of having to constantly add 2 or 3 points per pick, and remember your score at the end. Don't get down on yourself if you make different decisions than I do. This is mostly an exercise on how to generally draft well for the arena. But I'm certain there will be individual picks that could go one way or another. Just because you and I might end up differing a bit when all is said and done, doesn't mean there was only one right way to draft this deck. Just remember that for this exercise to work, view each fresh pick as if you made the same decision I did up to this point. If, for example, you picked 5 Murlocs up to the point where you had the option to draft a Murloc War Leader, while I only picked 1 Murloc up to that point, you might value the War Leader far higher than I would have. To keep things consistent, pretend your draft was identical to mine every time we move forward. So without further ado, let's get this draft rolling. I chose Sunwalker strongly in this pick. It's a solid roadblock against most players that can often be difficult to get through. It'll almost always give you at least 1-for-1 card value, and in many cases if your opponent doesn't have a Polymorph or Hex ready, it will eat up 2 or even 3 minions to get past. Arcane Golem is next best, although it's often a gamble to play it early and give the enemy an extra mana crystal unless you know your deck is going to be extremely aggressive. Finally, the Bloodsail Corsair is usually a 1/2-for-1 that will rarely trade for a card. It will occasionally trade for half of a weapon and get some value, but the unreliable effect is not worth the 1/2 body attached to it. Dark Iron Dwarf is one of the top 4-drops. At worst, it's a 4/4 for 4, and at best it allows another minion to trade up. All it asks of you is to have at least 1 minion on the board, something that isn't too hard to set up. The Dwarf is a valuable minion at all stages of the game and the clear choice here. Cruel Taskmaster comes in second, as its battlecry provides a lot of utility. It can finish off a weak enemy or provide a similar service as the Dark Iron Dwarf, but its 2/2 body isn't as good and sometimes its battlecry can backfire on you. Direwolf Alpha is also a decent buff card, but to get max value it asks you to have at least 2 minions on the board, something that's a bit harder to come by. Like the Cruel Taskmaster, its 2/2 body isn't too hot, so it pales in comparison to the Dark Iron Dwarf here. Worgen Infiltrator is probably the best Arena 1-drop since it can avoid hero pings and can often trade into a 2-drop 3/2. The early trade-up can usually establish tempo, plus it avoids the pitfalls most other 1-drops have, which is an easy clear from a hero ability due to its stealth. It's slightly better than the Argent Squire, which is probably the second best 1-drop minion due to its Divine Shield stickiness. But because Warrior doesn't have a 1 damage hero ability, it's harder to utilize the Squire's 1 damage. Reckless Racketeer is worst here, since it's effectively deal 5 damage for 6 mana, an inefficient prospect. Most of the time it acts as an expensive removal card. This one was tough, and I ended up going Cleave because I liked the potential for a cheap 2-for-1, and because there are a lot of 3/2s in the arena. But I don't fault anyone for picking Mad Bomber, so I didn't dock points if you chose it. Both are great 2-drops that can sometimes get lots of value. Alpha is the loser here because the other two simply do so much more in most cases. We talked about how good Fiery War Axe is earlier in this video. 3 damage is often enough to kill most 2 and 3 drop. Plus, its 2 mana makes it extremely cheap and efficient as a removal machine. It is leaps and bounds above Nightblade and Dalaran Mage. Consider Nightblade compared to the Dark Iron Dwarf. Nightblade is a 4/4 that costs 1 more mana, and its battlecry doesn't affect the board state. It effectively does less for you and costs more. Dalaran Mage is about as bad, since its 1 damage will rarely allow it to trade directly with an opposing minion. While a spell damage boosted Cleave is pretty nice, it's not worth picking up a poor card to risk the dream. A series of poor choices, and I also didn't dock people for certain picks. I chose Grunt because most of the time it will be good enough to kill an enemy 3/2. I don't care for Owl because its 1 HP body is too easy to kill, although the silence can occasionally be useful. Inner Rage is free, but does too little in my opinion to be worth a card. Maybe if I had a lot of activators in the deck prior to this point, like Acolyte of Pain or Frothing Berserker, I would consider it, but at this point it's a pass. Hey, speak of the devil! Acolyte of Pain is now here and is acceptable as a 3-drop. The value in Acolyte is anyone using a removal spell on it will almost always lose card advantage since they spend a card and I cycle it. However, its 1 damage is a bit lackluster. Fortunately, I already have a Dark Iron Dwarf, so maybe I could get some value here. We already talked about Rocketeer and Inner Rage as poor cards, so they were easy to pass up. A hard choice. Raptor is a solid 3/2 for 2, so I don't begrudge anyone for picking this. In many cases that probably would be my choice, but I was feeling a bit experimental because I usually don't like Frost Elemental's 5/5 body for 6, but I wanted to see if the tempo gained by the freeze might be worth a shot. In either case, both of these cards are better than the Bodyguard, which usually can die to a 4 or sometimes even 3 mana card. Bluegill can usually be viewed as a 2 damage removal spell for 2 mana, since it will almost never survive and will often only be played as a 2-drop against select heroes that don't have a 1 damage hero ability. That's not terrible, especially compared to the other alternatives. Battle Rage needs you to have damaged minions on the board to get good value, and usually it's a bad idea for enemies to leave lots of damaged minions on the board, so it will rarely net you a flood of cards. Corehound is too expensive for the 5 HP body, and will usually trade down. If it gets a chance to swing to the face for 9, you're in good shape, but then again you were probably already winning by that point anyways. A trio of 3-drops! Flood Knight far and away represents the highest upside since Divine Shield minions are abundant in the arena. Usually Captain is significantly better than War Leader because his buff only can help your minions, but since we have 1 Murloc up to this point, I figured War Leader is just as good, or bad, as the Captain. Ultimately though, all 3 of these will likely turn into a 3/3 for 3. Dwarf, as discussed earlier, is super solid, so it's our choice here. If we had more weapons up to this point, I would be much more inclined to draft the Smith though, since its Enrage is amazing for weapon heroes. If I was a rogue, I likely would have gone with the Smith because you have a guaranteed hero ability weapon. Whirlwind is too situational and 1 damage isn't too great, so it eats dust compared to the other 2. Raptor is a solid 3/2 for 2. Tidehunter is sort of a 3/2 for 2, but easier to pick apart and usually worse. Magma Rager is worse still against heroes that ping, which represents the top heroes in the arena. A pretty easy choice for me here. Oh lordy, a legendary choice in this arena run. Baron Geddon is the best choice here because its surprise board clearing potential can sometimes give incredible value, especially since heroes won't expect to consecrate like clear from a warrior. Loatheb comes in second place as a solid 5/5 for 5, but the battle cry means much less in the arena than it does in Constructed, where there are many more spell-based decks. Loatheb could be used to delay a Flame Strike for a turn, but it's much more likely your opponent will have a playable 5 or 6 drop minion to play and ignore the battle cry. Pagel is too slow, and in its nerfed state of card draw potential, it has no place in our deck. Slam is awesome removal. In a pinch it's removal, and at other times it can soften up an enemy for a trade while replacing itself with a card. Geomancer at this point will only synergize with Cleave, Useful, but I don't have enough spells to warrant reaching for a 2/2 minion. Booty Bay comes back once again to try and plead its case, but until it learns to grow more HP, I'm going to continue ignoring it. Brewmaster is a solid 3/2 for 2 whose hero ability is clunky from time to time, but can usually be played around. Panther and Hunter are both so-so 3-drops that can hold their own against other 3-drops, but as a warrior I'm more concerned with having 2-drop options, and I'm less concerned with shoring up the 3-drop slot. Usually a decent 2-drop can be serviceable to play on turn 3, but unless you have the coin, it can't work in reverse. I'm not usually a fan of Execute, but compared to the others I think it's the best pick here. I already have another Frost Elemental, and it's not a card you want to have too many of given its 5/5 body. Priestess of Elune is even worse with a 5/4 body and a battle cry that doesn't affect the board. Execute may at least help me clean up a lingering threat or bring down a lumbering beast. Argent Squire continues to get no love from me as we decide that Gurabashi is slightly better. On the plus side, I at least have a Slam in this deck as a single activator, and I'm light on 5-drops up to this point. Squire comes in second place though, as a respectable 1-drop, while Corehound sandbags it for reasons already discussed. Yeti swoops in to save the day as the king of the arena. A 4/5 for 4 is stupendous, as it will pretty much trade for every other 2 or 3-drop, most other 4-drops, and its 5 HP requires premium removal to deal with. Coming in at a close second is the Tiger, a stealthed 5/5 for 5 that has a soft place in my heart since it survives Flame Strikes, and gives you a chance to set something up without being removed. Flesh-Eating Ghoul has the potential to be scary good, but it pales in comparison to the other 2 because they are far more reliable. Hooray, another weapon! Arcanite Reaper's 5 damage can deal with most threats that are played at or below 5 mana, so it's often a big board presence. If I had more weapons in this deck and didn't desperately need something like the Reaper, Dread Corsair is actually fairly decent in Warrior, since you can sometimes play it for 1 or even 0 mana. If I already had 3 or 4 weapons in this deck, I would likely have considered it here. Dancing Swords is an interesting card, and a new one to the arena meta. Its 4 HP at 3 mana is pretty good, but it scares me to give an opponent the card upon its death. And unless I have a lot of silence and removal in my deck, I have a feeling I'll generally prefer more solid 3-drops to it in the future. Deja Vu. Now where have we seen this pick before? Oh yes, in this very draft 10 picks ago. My reasoning has not changed since then, and we've gained no more Pirates or Murlocs, so Blood Knight remains the pick. Tiger is a solid 5/5 we discussed previously, and it beats the other options. I've talked about Bluegill Warrior as being adequate, but it's not a true 2-drop in the sense that I'd always be happy to play it on turn 2. Shieldbearer usually acts as a delay and throws away a card while the enemy expands on their board state, and will almost never be picked by me unless my deck is chock full of buffing minions. Kor'kron is a solid charge minion at 4 mana that often acts as a 4 damage removal spell for 4. Sometimes it can get extra value by surviving the turn it's played, or you can plop it down on an empty board for some significant surprise damage. I value it slightly higher than the Cruel Taskmaster, and both of them are much better than the Bodyguard, who once again is desperately trying to claw its way in here. Another Reaper makes me happy, but after 2 of them I'd value future ones much lower. Knight and Raptor are both very serviceable cards that I'd be happy to pick when you up against other average cards, but the Reaper's clearing power and damage potential take the cake here. I went against the grain according to arenavalue.com and went with a champion here. My reasoning is I needed a bit of late game beef, and the champion can be a huge turnaround when you have board control. A bit of a win more card, that's true, but a 6/6 body even at 7 mana is still pretty imposing. And in an even board state, playing this card will turn the game around. Earthen Ring is a very solid 3-drop though, so I didn't dock anyone for picking it. They are both better cards than the Gurabashi here, and I don't think there's a strong justification to picking that guy up, especially now that I have more 5-drop options. We've already talked about the Tidehunter and the Gurabashi, and how they're not too great. Fairy Dragon, on the other hand, is a very solid 3/2 that can't be pinged by the mage, and can't be targeted by spells. Warriors don't have many direct buffing spells either, so it's a win-win. Another 3-drop is just what the Doctor ordered, and Scarlet Crusader is an excellent one. To make things even better, I already have 2 Blood Knights, so there's a chance I can activate an early game 6/6 with this card. Both Lord of the Arena and Corehound are bad for the same reason Booty Bay Bodyguard is bad. Too easy to kill for their mana costs. Lord is slightly better because of the cheaper cost in the taunt, but only just. Oh my goodness, some more Murloc synergy. Of course it's still a bad card here, and its battle cry can backfire. Mortal Strike is the choice here, since it's 4 direct damage for 4, and if you're low enough it's equivalent to a Fireball, which we all know to be a wonderful mage card. Demolisher when protected can do work, but I don't like playing it on turn 3 because it's too wimpy, and I'd much prefer more solid 3-drop options. I see merits for all the choices here. Warlord can be a big 5-drop, and the jury's still out on the Ghoul, but it can be an Acolyte Gurubashi activator as well as a serviceable early game 2-drop. Still, I like the consistency of the Knight here, as it can easily clean up an early game 2 HP minion and immediately impacts the board, while the other cards take a turn before you can do much with them. I didn't dock much for any selection here though, because this could be a preference pick. I value Heroic Strike more highly than Silver Moon or Charge, mostly because it's very flexible. It can be a 2-mana removal spell, or it can help add damage to a weapon to slay something really big, or to provide the last bit of burst for lethal. Silver Moon Guardian isn't bad, but it's somewhat weak as a 4-drop since it often does about the same thing as Scarlet Crusader, which is a 3-drop. With my 2 Blood Knights, it does have some viability here, but I already have strong turn 4 plays with the Dark Iron Dwarf, the Yeti, and the Stormwind Knight. Charge, on the other hand, is quite bad. It costs 3 mana for a minor buff. Warsong Commander offers the comparable ability and leaves behind a 2/3 body. Regardless of your thoughts on the other 2, it's not in contention here. Not the most ideal final pick options, but Upgrade at least offers some appeal, since I have 3 other weapons in this run. If the opponent plays a 1-drop with 1 HP, it's perfectly reasonable to use early, but it can also act like a 4 damage removal spell for 1 mana when combined with Fiery War Axe, or a 6 damage removal spell for 1 mana when combined with the Reaper. Armorsmith is great in a constructed deck that focuses on the late game, but that's not what we have here, and at best we have to treat it like a mediocre 1/4 for 2 that sometimes gives you a minor bit of health. At least it's better than Mana Addict. The turn you play Mana Addict, it's a wimpy 1/3 that can easily be removed. If it somehow survives that turn, it could deal a lot of damage the following turn, but I don't have enough spells to make it useful, and after I'm done, it would go back to a 1/3 all over again. A low value card whose only saving grace is when used in spell heavy decks as a finisher. But again, that's not what we have here, so we must avoid it. So there we go, we've completed the draft for this deck. Let's take a quick look at the pros and cons. Pros are we have a handful of solid weapons and a decent amount of surprise damage with charge minions. This deck seems to have a decent amount of reach, which will be useful to close out games where I command the early game but start to sputter if the opponent can claw their way back. Another pro is I have some solid mid-game cards with 2 Dark Iron Dwarves, 1 Yeti, 1 Tiger, and a few Arcanite Reapers. If I win the early game, my mid-game should be able to put most games away. A final pro is, surprisingly, 2 Blood Knights. People will rarely see epic cards coming, and the fact that I have 2 of these bad boys means there's a good chance I can steal maybe a game or 2 with a turn 3 6/6. Not reliable, but it could help ease what could otherwise be a tough match. Cons are a slightly concerning amount of 2-drops. I should have enough for most games, but a bad starting draw will leave me reeling early, since once I recover in the mid-game, it'll be hard for my late game to close it out. I don't have a whole lot of late game beef, although maybe Baron Geddon will get me out of a pinch or 2. Another con is the amount of face damage I'll be taking with my weapons, and limited healing outside of my hero ability. If I eat too much early damage, some aggressive decks may be able to pour it on and I'll be stuck making suboptimal plays with my weapons. Overall, I'm shooting for the usual goal, 7 wins with this deck, but I'm notoriously poor as a judge of how well a deck will do in the arena. What do you guys think? Does this deck have what it takes, or will it fall short? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, as well as any other feelings regarding what you think I could have done differently. Finally, we move on to the scoring portion of the video. Like I said at the beginning of this video, this is really a rough guideline for prospective arena pros, and there were certainly places this draft could have gone that I didn't take. Who knows, maybe you Murloc fanatics out there can bring this bad boy to 12 wins, even if you would have gotten a poor score according to my draft. Well, that's all I have for you today. In my next video, we'll be taking this draft through the ringer and see how well it fares. I'll walk through its key moments during the arena run and analyze the plays I made and what I could have done differently, all in the name of science. As always, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to check out more of my work at HearthstonePlayers.com or subscribe to my YouTube channel. I've been MrShine, and I'll see you next time!